Thank you for joining us on She's with the Band.
In this episode, part 2 of Sue's adventures in the United States. Sue discusses the treacherous insecurity of the society in Los Angeles, as well as hilarious stories playing Trivial Pursuit with Eric Clapton, and a wet and wild New Year's Eve party with a famous band, The Who.
She's with the band. She's with the band.
This podcast is brought to you by Dover Street Productions and may contain some content that some listeners might find offensive.
Let's begin.
It wasn't easy in LA. It was difficult, especially on the social side, because they're very insecure there. It's a town, it can be very destructive. It's very seductive, LA, but at the same time, it's very destructive. And it's very youth-oriented. You know, if you're 25, you're over the hill, quite honestly. And the women didn't want you at their parties because they were so insecure. They thought if you were reasonable, looking, they'd think you'd go off with their men. And then the men in the studios, who, even though they might have been senior vice president of whatever, they were answerable to the board in New York. They were only employees at the end of the day, and women had started to be very prevalent in the film business in by then. And they were insecure, the guys, because they thought you might be after their job. So it was a bit of a tricky thing to navigate. But as I say, all my friends were English. Then I had a really nice job. I worked for quite a few different people. I had a really nice job working for this studio called Intravision, which was a visual effects studio. In fact, I took Putnam round it. After Putnam had the tour of Intravision, he was so impressed with it that he recommended it to Michael Caton-Jones to be used in the next movie that David was producing, which I believe was Memphis Belle. Did you ever see the film Stand By Me? Well, that was done in the studio. So when you see the children walking along the track, they're just walking along a sawhorse in the studio. Very clever. They put people into first generation. I don't understand it all. When David came, I got Tom, who I worked for, one of his sons, to give him the grand tour, and he was very impressed. They did a lot of good stuff. And I worked for Tom, but also produced television commercials for them. Well, he hired me as his PA because he knew my background, and because what he had was so special with the visual effects, I must have said to him, look, I think we should do television commercials. So I flew to New York and had meetings with advertising people. That was my last job in LA. But whilst all this was going on, Des Brown, who was in the music business in London, and he came out to LA to live. I'm not quite sure what he was doing out there, but he had this project. Ray Coleman, who was the editor of Disc, had written a book about John Lennon's early life. And Des, I don't know if he actually optioned it. I don't know if there was what the deal was, but he said he had the rights to it. I don't know if any money exchanged hands, quite honestly. But what was more important, that because he was in the music business, but because of that, he got the rights to the Lennon-McCartney catalogue, it was gold. Nobody got the rights to the catalogue. So he wanted to make a movie, but he had no idea how to go about it. I persuaded him that he needed my help, but he'd have to go into partnership with me. We'd have to be co-producers on it. This might have started before I started to work for Intravision. Might have started, and then I got the Intravision job. So the whole thing was going on right. So Michael Apted was a friend of mine, and I discussed it with Michael. I said, would he be interested in directing it? And he said yes. And I said, so who are we going to get to write the screenplay? And he said, I think Ray Connolly would be great. As opposed to Ray Coleman, who'd written the Beatles. Ray Connolly was a music journalist I think Ray was on the Evening Standard. He was a really serious music journalist from Liverpool. And he had written the screenplays for Stardust and That'll Be the Day, which Putnam had produced. I don't know if Michael directed both of them, but he definitely directed one of them. He said, I think that Ray would be great. So he got in touch with Ray in London, and Ray said he'd be interested. So now we needed to package a deal with a film company. So I went to Warner Brothers and I got a meeting with Mark Rosenberg, who was VP in charge of production. The most fabulous guy. He was great. He was absolutely great. He was a guy, great sense of humor. Everybody loved him. And he took a bit of a shine to me, I think. Not in that way. I just think he liked my enthusiasm for the project. Des came with me, obviously, to the meeting, and Apted came with me as well. And he loved it. I mean, this was our first meeting. He loved it, wanted to do a development deal with us. But he said, I'd like to make a suggestion. I think as you two have never produced a movie before. He said, you need an executive producer. So I said, sure. He said, could I suggest somebody? By all means. And he said, I've got David Putnam in mind. So I looked at him and I thought, oh, well, this is kismet. Because he hadn't spoken to Putnam at that stage. He said, so with your permission, I'll ask him. And I remember saying, he'll do it. I said, David will do it. Absolutely sure he'll do it. Because he'll want to help me. And sure enough, David came on board. Ray flew out. Everything was negotiated with his agent, Ray's agent in London, by Warner Brothers. We all signed contracts and everything. Ray writes the first draft and we all love it. And then, just right after this, Mark Rosenberg dies. He has a massive heart attack. It was so sad. He was only in his 40s, I'd say maybe mid to late 40s. It was awful. The loveliest, loveliest guy. And Lucy Fisher takes over from him. And she likes the project. Her PA at the time, who sat outside her office, was none other than David Heyman, producer of Harry Potter, Paddington, and, well, you name it. Yes, I can remember David sitting outside the office. But Warner Brothers, well, Lucy, they didn't like the first draft as much as we liked the first draft. And he wrote a second draft, which they liked, but we didn't like it as much. And in the end, it just didn't work for them. And they put it into Turnaround, which was really sad because we'd been with this project for a while. I don't know how long. It was going to be called Working Class Hero, John Lennon's early life. So an Australian company picked it up, and then it just all kind of disbanded. Everybody went their different way. I moved back to England in 89. And then, of course, Sam Taylor made the film, didn't she? But it just didn't work out. The timing with Mark was such a shame. But it obviously wasn't meant to be. I'm a great believer in fate, and it wasn't meant to be for whatever reason. So I ended my time in LA with my last job being for Introvision. It was time to come home. I'd been there for 8 years. My great friends there were Prue and David Hemmings, who I met through Lawrence Myers, funnily enough, who was in the offices when I worked, for the Slim and Frere Miller. And Lawrence and I had remained friends, and he was always out in LA. And one night he introduced me to David and Prue, and it was love at first sight. I became great friends. They were my family. In fact, I'm godmother to their daughter. And And they lived in Malibu, and I used to spend most weekends down in Malibu with them. They always had lunch parties. Whoever was visiting from London was there. David was a game player. We were always playing charades, and David liked games. We were always playing Trivial Pursuit. That had become very hot then, Trivial Pursuit. And whoever was in town, people like John Hurt used to be there for lunch, Helen Mirren, Peter Medak, who's a director. Well, Peter lived there, lovely guy. He was always there. So many people. George C. Scott was a great friend of theirs. So he was often there. I met oodles of people. Anyway, Trivial Pursuit was such a big thing. And Peter Asher lived just along the beach at Malibu with his wife, Wendy. And sometimes they'd do lunches, and I'd go because I was always staying over at David and Prue's. And because there were so many people there for lunch on a Sunday, when it came to Trivial Pursuits, people had to partner up because there wasn't enough room for everybody. The only thing I was quite good at was the entertainment one, which was the pink coloured one, entertainment. So it was like film and music. And so I was okay at that, hopeless at most other things. And so I'm partnered with this chap one time, and he said, "Oh, hello, my name's," I think he said Glenn, and I said, "Hello, I'm Sue." So I said, "Have you got any strengths?" I said, "Because the only thing I'm decent at is the pink one, music and film." He said, "I'm okay on that." So we started playing, and he got all these music ones right. I mean, he was just fantastic. So I remember turning around to him and saying, honestly, I said, "You're so successful, you know the answer to all these." I said, "You could be in the music business." So he said, "Well, I am." I said, "Oh, what do you do?" I said, "I used to be in the music business in London." And he said, "Oh, I'm in a band." And I said, "Would I have heard of them?" He said, "Oh, I don't know, we're a small band." I said, "Well, who? I might have heard of them, you know." He said, "The Eagles." I think it was Glenn Frey. It could have been Don Henley, but I've got a feeling it was Glenn Frey. Yes, the Eagles. And then another time, actually, I was partnered with Clapton. And so I said to him, "Well, we'll be all right on the music questions, on the pink music questions." He was hopeless at all of them. I said, "Oh, you're a rubbish partner."
So were there any fabulous New Year's Eve parties that you found particularly notable?
Well, New Year, Ready, Steady, Go always did New Year. After my years there, normal people had normal parties, didn't they? They threw great big New Year's Eve parties. Well, when I was still in the business, but I wasn't a journalist, I became an agent in the music business. So New Year's Eve was always the place to be, was Ready, Steady, Go, because they had great artists on. They had the biggest that they could get. I mean, if the Beatles would have been in town, they would have been on. And the Stones were always around. Oh, there was one New Year's Eve. Oh, I remember it because it was snowing really, really heavily, which is not a good sign on New Year's Eve, because you try getting a cab when it's snowing in London and everybody wants to be places and go wherever. And I remember this particularly because I dressed a little unusually for the time. I mean, normally you were in a mini skirt, usually, and boots. I had a Nello and David suede lace. They made the ballet shoes of Nello and David. They're still there in St. Martin's Lane, but they did these suede boots. I had them in burgundy suede, and they did up like skating boots to the knee. So I guess one would have worn those then. But I wore this outfit, and I thought it was a nice outfit for New Year's Eve. It was a black tailored velvet jacket, and it had white revers, and it had a long, very tight but long skirt. I thought that was quite cool. And I remember you kind of collected people on the way when it was New Year's Eve, I guess. And everyone was going, this group of people was going on to the ad-lib. The ad-lib was very in at the time. And I think Brian had said to me, because he was there and the Animals were on that night, I think, I'm not sure if McCartney was in there, I don't know, but I remember him being at the ad-lib later. And Brian said, oh, we're going off to the ad-lib after. Do you want to come with us, I suppose? So I said, sure. And so he looked at me and he said, well, you're not coming dressed like that, are you? So I said, what do you mean not coming dressed like that? This is what I'm wearing. He just obviously didn't approve of this long skirt and he didn't like the look of me in this skirt. So I said, well, this is what I'm wearing. And then Cathy McGowan, she was in a black velvet trouser suit that night. So I went over to her and I said, have you got anything that I can wear instead of this skirt? So she said, well, why didn't you borrow my trousers, my black velvet trousers? I'll go with your jacket. So she gave me her black velvet trousers. And I don't know what happened, but one lot went off. I may have been putting the trousers on and everybody went off without me and left me there. And I thought, oh, well, what do I do now? How do I get there? Coming down this snow. And there was Alan Price, also seemed a bit left behind, because I think they'd appeared that night, the Animals. Don't know where Eric was. And Alan said, well, why don't you come with me to the ad-lib? So I went, oh, okay. He said, well, we'll get a cab. So we went outside and Rediffusion, where Ready, Steady, Go was on the corner of Kingsway, which is the top of the Aldwych. It was at the top of on the corner of the Aldwych and Kingsway. Do you think we could get a cab? We walked all the way to the ad-lib. It was in Leicester Square, the ad-lib. Well, that's quite a walk when it's snowing, and I can't tell you what I had on my feet. And I certainly didn't have a coat because I was in this jacket. All I know was that I was an absolute shivering wreck when I got there. And there was this whole group of people at the ad-lib. I'm wondering if Brian Epstein was actually there or we just went to his place after. And if McCartney was, I think McCartney was there, must have been George Martin and Judy, who later became his wife. There's this whole group of us. And I can see that Alan Price, I think he thought he was on a promise because he'd said, well, that's how they operated then. They invite you to a nightclub. I think they think that they've got their leg over at the end of the evening. That was the attitude of people in the music business, really. Invite a girl somewhere and that's it. You're away. And I can see, so we were around at Brian's for this nightclub. It's obviously, I don't know, 1 o'clock in the morning, whatever. And Brian played us. It was Silla's new single, but it was a very powerful single. So it could have been You've Lost That Loving Feeling. And I remember we all listened to it and thought it was wonderful. And I can see that Alan's getting very leery. And I thought, I don't want to be left with him at the end of this evening, however this is going to pan out, because I was a bit concerned, as he'd had a lot to drink, that he might get a bit aggressive with me. And thank goodness George Martin, who lived in St John's Wood at the time, said, would I like a lift? I said, thank you, that would be lovely. He was not happy, Alan Price, then, but he probably wouldn't have remembered it the next day because he had so much to drink. Yeah, so that was my New Year's Eve experience. Off with the skirt, on with Cathy McGowan's trousers, which I must have given her back the next week. And there was another awful New Year's Eve because it was snowing again. It always snowed. Oh, I tell you, I do remember this party. So this would have been in the 70s. I was very friendly with Jan and Kenny Jones. Kenny Jones being the drummer with The Who after he was the drummer with the Faces. And Jan and Kenny lived very near me. And we were very friendly, socialised. They invited my nieces to their kids' birthday parties. I mean, we were good friends. Bill Curbishley, who was their manager, threw a big party. It was a Christmas party. And I was going on holiday the next day. This was the night before. I was going to Barbados for Christmas. So this was before Christmas. And he threw it in this, it's the hotel, it's on Sloane Street. It's in the middle of Sloane Street on the right-hand side going down towards Sloane Square. And it had a swimming pool in the basement, which was where the party was. And there was all this space around the pool where the tables were and everything. And I walked in there. I went with Jan and Kenny. And I can remember exactly what I had on. I had a jumpsuit, but it was like it was an evening. It was like a voile or something like that. It was a very fine material. It was an all-in-one jumpsuit. And I had these very high pink deep fuchsia sandals on. This is in the middle of bloody winter, freezing out there. And I was flying the next morning and I walked into this room. And I could see exactly where this was going, what was leading. And I thought, it's everyone to themselves because we're all going to end up in the pool. And I thought, there's no way I can end up in the pool. So we sat back. Jan and I said, right, we're not sitting around the perimeter of this pool. And we sat back. And there came a point in the evening, and I had no idea it was going to. Everybody had been thrown in the pool by this point, and I thought, oh, thank God, I had to get up early in the morning and fly out. And Bill Curbishley, he and I were never mates, Bill Curbishley, but I'd spent quite a lot of time with The Who when Kenny was in it later, and I was with them in New York, and I could see out the corner of my eye, I don't think it was him, but he must have sent somebody and said, go and get Sue. She's the next for the pool. I had no chance. Pick me up, whoever this was. I was furious. I had my jewelry on in the pool. I was fit to be tied. I can see myself drying my hair in the hand dryer, in the loo, in the hot air thing. Everybody was thrown in the pool and I thought I'd escaped it. Oh, the funniest thing happened in New York. This was 1979. There was the premiere of Quadrophenia in New York. Frank Rodham had directed it. And they were also playing Madison Square Garden. And I was in LA on holiday. I'd been there for 6 weeks. I set myself up at the Beverly Hills Hotel. I mean, why not? They had this single room there that I can remember at the time cost $39 a night, which is probably like £200 now, maybe then in 1979. And my hangers at home to this day are the pink hangers. I took them all from the Beverly Hills Hotel. They knew me so well there because I was always around the pool. I was always welcome around the pool. Sven, who ruled the pool. So Jan said, why don't you fly out to New York? Because my 6 weeks was coming to an end instead of going home. And come to the premiere and to the Madison Square Garden gig. So I thought, why not? And they were staying in one of the hotels on Central Park South. And I had a client. I was his agent in London. His name was Ben Thomas. And he lived on West 57th Street. I think it was a studio. And he said, well, come and stay with me. So I went, okay, fine. And I said, oh, do you want to come to Madison Square Garden? Sure, why not? So I don't know which came first, Madison Square Garden or the Quadrophenia. And I knew the producer of Quadrophenia because when I shared offices with Marilyn Johnson in London, he was there because he produced The Sweeney. And Marilyn cast The Sweeney out of our offices. So he was there. So there was quite a lot of people that I knew there anyway. So it was nice that I knew people. So at the opening night of Quadrophenia, to my great surprise and delight, I bump into Tom Clegg, who'd flown over for the premiere because he had just directed Daltrey in McVicar. And he also co-wrote it with McVicar got credit for it as well. So that's why he'd flown out to be part of the celebrations. And as an interesting little sideline to this, Marilyn Johnson, who I shared offices with in London, we had a duplex in Little Newport Street behind the Talk of the Town, which is now the Hippodrome. And Marilyn had the lower floor. I had the top floor, which had the casting couch in and the television set. And Marilyn, Pammy and Susie, they were her staff, were in the office below. And because she'd cast the Sweeney, they were the same producers that were producing McVicar, and she cast it out of our offices, which is quite unusual because usually casting sessions are done at the production company. And John McVicar wanted to be there at the casting sessions. Now, he was really very nice, John, but you have to remember in his old days, he was a hardened criminal and escaped prison. He was up for GBH. He wasn't nice people then, and he went on the run for quite a long time. And then when they caught him, he became a reformed person when he went back into the clink, and he started lecturing at police stations and to prisoners and everything. Anyway, so there he was in our office for 1 or 2 weeks, and he used to come to the pub with us, which that's another little story actually at the pub. We used to go to the Coach and Horses, actually, which became very famous because of the play Geoffrey Barnard is Unwell, because he would be at the Coach and Horses where the play took place with Peter O'Toole. And then Private Eye would have their weekly meetings there every Wednesday. And Norman, who the play was about, as well as Geoffrey Barnard, and Norman was known as the rudest landlord in London. He used to stand there and scratch his backside. He was not very couth, but he loved us girls. We used to go in there about twice a week for lunch, and we just used to rock up, and it was always full. And we used to, I don't know, had a toasted sandwich or whatever. His mother made the sandwiches, this little old lady behind the bar, and he had his wife working there as well. And so we used to walk in and all the tables were taken. So he'd go up to somebody in the middle of their lunch and he'd just take it away. And they'd go, well, I haven't finished. She said, you have now. The girls have arrived. He loved us. Anyway, getting back to John McVicar, this particular Friday was the day you did the banking. And all your checks that you'd been paid, maybe cash, I don't know, but everybody paid you by check. They were all banked on a Friday. So Susie's on her way to the bank with everything in this sort of pouch, this sort of cloth pouch holding it. And John says, where are you going, Suze? So she said, well, I'm off to the bank, John. He said, where's the bank? She said, Shaftesbury Avenue. He says, I'm not having you go there on your own, girl. He says, you don't know who might be around. He said, it's not safe. He said, I'm coming with you. Which was really very funny considering his reputation. He probably had an arm bar tucked up the side of his trousers or something. And after, there was a big party in, I think, Pete's suite at the hotel. And I had on, there's a picture of Jan and I that night. In those days, you often wore as a top, if you wore a jacket, you often wore a leotard underneath instead of a t-shirt, because it had a scoop neck. It was a little bit dressier. And I had this lovely Chinese antique jacket on, blue with white embroidery. And I had this white leotard on. And I must have had a pair of jeans on, probably. So it was a terrible production going to the loo because everything had to come off if you had a leotard on. So we were at the party and it's in full swing and I needed to go to the bathroom, which was literally off the living room. It was there. So I went into the loo and the lock didn't work on the loo. And the loo was near the door. It wasn't at the other end. So I thought to myself, if I could just kind of not quick enough, because there I am on the loo with everything round my ankles, and this guy who I didn't know who he was breezed in and went, I'm so sorry, and ran out again, right? And then a little bit later, And I can remember the record the big record of the night. It was Elvis Costello's Oliver's Army. We were all kind of twisting to it. I think there was a lot of Dave Edmunds music that night as well. And I remember dancing. And Kenny, he was talking to somebody, and he said, "Frank, have you met Sue Mortner? Frank Rodham, Sue Mortner." So Frank said, and I realised who it was. So Frank said, "Oh, I've definitely met Sue earlier this evening." He was the guy that walked into the loo with everything round my ankles. That was quite funny. And then at Madison Square Garden, oh, it was brilliant. Jan and I were on stage, standing on the side of the stage, watching the concert. Brilliant. They were brilliant, The Who. They were absolutely brilliant. So that was a fun time. Oh, when I lived in LA, Ronnie Lane, who was one of the faces, he had MS much later. When I was living in LA, he had it really badly. And all the guys decided to raise money. They were going to do a tour. They did England, and they definitely did LA. And they were all on it. Eric, Charlie, Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, Rod, I mean, you name them, they came out for him, right? And believe it or not, there were certain people in all those years when I was a journalist that I had never met. I'd never met Clapton, I'd never met Elton. Those two names come to mind. I never crossed. Although my friend Maura, who was she became head of Warner Brothers actually, but she was head of publicity at Warner Brothers. At Maura's wedding, Rod was there. I remember that, but otherwise, certain people I never met, and I was a massive Clapton fan. So a really good friend of mine, Dale, who was with A&M Records, he was part of putting this whole thing together, because that's how I met Kenny and Jan. And so I was living, as I said, in LA in the 80s. This was in the 80s, and they did, I'm not sure if it was the Forum, whatever the theatre was. And I'll never forget when Jimmy Page walked on stage. But you think you've heard noise when it's like Springsteen. It was bigger. It was like the Messiah when Jimmy Page came on stage. It was absolutely brilliant. And they were staying at the Westwood Marquee. And certain people threw parties for them. And I was part of this whole whirlwind, which was brilliant. Anyway, I'd never met Clapton. And this particular night, I thought, I've got to say something. I went up to him and I said, "I'm really sorry. I don't want to sound really fanny, but I am one of your biggest fans." I said, "I've never missed a concert," whatever. And we had a nice little chat. And the next day, so I went back. It was like the base. I went back the next day for wherever we were going that day. And I'm waiting in the lift in the foyer to go up to wherever. And the lift doors open and the people start walking out. And Eric comes out the lift and he goes, "Hi, Sue, how are you?" These people made my day. But then Eric and I encountered each other a few years later in LA when we were partners in Trivial Pursuit. Yes, because I thought, he said, "Hello, Sue." And then Charlie I never had a lot to do with, because he was very shy, Charlie. Yes, because he was on the tour. He was one of the drummers. They did them in whoever. It didn't matter if you had two drummers, but because Kenny was a drummer, and obviously Charlie was a drummer. So I can't remember how it worked to raise money for MS for Ronnie. And I thought, well, do I say hello to Charlie? He hasn't said anything to me. I hadn't spoken to him. It'd been a long time since I'd seen him. It'd been like 20 odd years. And so I went up to him and I said, "Do you remember me?" He says, "Do you remember me?" "What?" He said, "I thought you weren't going to talk to me." So I said, "So why didn't you say hello to me?" Because he's very reserved. Charlie was very reserved. He was a real gentleman. Yeah.
In the next episode of She's With the Band, Sue gives some exclusive anecdotes and wild stories to describe how important the 1960s and 70s were for music history and just how special that decade of her life was.
She's with the band.